It is News and Information 570 KLIF. Dan Madison for Grant Stinchfield. How are you for a Friday? Well, great news for one John Wiley Price being found not guilty. Dallas County Commissioner, of course. I want to welcome on in Christopher Lewis, a nationally recognized Dallas County criminal defense lawyer, and our guest to break this down. Chris, appreciate you being with us. So this was a 7-week trial, and John Wiley Price was accused of accepting more than $1 million in bribes in the form of cash, cars, real estate, you name it. Now that everything's over with and he's been found not guilty, at least for now, what was the evidence against him specifically, and why didn't it convince the jury? Because, as you and I both know, this has been a long time coming.
Yeah, it has. I mean, the $1 million was payments for various vehicles, that kind of thing. So the evidence against him were canceled checks, they were deposits into bank accounts, they were those types of things. Coming from Kathy Neely. And Kathy Neely, we know about the relationship between she and Commissioner Price. Kathy Neely represented a bunch of different companies that were trying to get Dallas County's business. And then the government's case essentially was that John Wiley Price, that his vote for these contractors was essentially up for sale, and that's what was going on between he and Kathy Neely. So it was a lot of circumstantial evidence. There wasn't any real smoking gun in this case. There wasn't a real discernible victim, I think, to get the jury fired up. And ultimately, I just think that the government lost a little bit of steam and definitely lost credibility with the jury throughout the course of the trial.
Yeah, we also know that Price's top assistant, Daphne Fain, also found not guilty on tax charges and lying to the FBI. Now, we haven't seen – first of all, I guess I should ask, is jury makeup part of this conversation? Do we know men, women, race? Does that part of the whole synopsis of what happened during this trial?
Yeah, we know what the makeup of the jury was. I believe, oh gosh, I don't know off the top of my head, but it was pretty evenly split. I think in terms of, well, actually there were more women on the jury than men. There were, I believe they said 4 minorities on the jury, African American, maybe 2 African Americans. But if you're asking, do I think that the makeup of the jury had anything to do with him being found guilty? Absolutely not. And in this criminal trial, like every criminal trial, you have to have a unanimous verdict. And this is a jury that sat and they listened to everything. They talked about it for a long time. And on the most serious counts, they found him not guilty. And you can see that they weren't all in agreement on the evidence, because on the tax counts, the failure to report income tax, they were split on that, and that resulted in a mistrial. So this was not a jury that was just in lockstep with one side or with the other. But I think that they looked at the evidence and they said that the counts that dealt with the corruption and the bribery, that the jury just didn't make its case. I'm sorry, that the prosecution didn't make its case.
Yeah, the jury did deliberate since, Wednesday, so they did have a couple of days of deliberation. And you were talking about how the government didn't really make their case. One of the things that I find interesting is that the FBI raided his house, 6 years ago, and this corruption investigation goes back to 2005. So I guess part of the question is, why did it take so long to indict him finally in 2014? And as I said, this has been a long time coming. I would have thought, anyway, that this would have been a slam dunk, but obviously not.
A lot of people thought it would be a slam dunk, and I think the government thought it would be a slam dunk, if not on the bribery and the corruption counts, for sure the tax count. That was their safety net. That was where they thought they knew that they would get a conviction even if everything else fell apart. And, it's the best laid plans. Yeah, the reason why it took so long is because this is the way federal prosecutions do. This is the way they typically go. You have a long investigatory time period. We have a raid that happened 6 years ago. It takes a long time before they even present it to the grand jury, because they want to make sure that their case is absolutely airtight, solid. And that's why the prosecution doesn't lose many cases in federal court. But this was a case that was all built on circumstantial evidence and a whole lot of connecting the dots that had to go on. And the prosecution asked the jury to connect the dots the way that they saw the case. And I think that the defense just made a much more compelling case and compelling argument than what, and they didn't lose the credibility. You know how Judge Lynn chastised the prosecution several times for not turning over evidence in a timely manner. Ultimately, I think that affected the credibility of the prosecution.
Christopher Lewis is a nationally recognized Dallas County criminal defense lawyer and our guest talking about the not guilty verdict of Dallas County Commissioner John Wiley Price. Now, we haven't seen the last of this case. Kathy Neely, who is Price's top political consultant. Now, she's going to be tried, if I'm not mistaken, sir, at a later time. Is this a preview of that trial and possible outcome? Is there any other evidence they might submit for this trial at a later date?
Dan, I think based upon what happened today, that maybe the happiest person in the world is Kathy Neely, because she was charged with conspiring with these other individuals to do the same exact type of thing. So sure, they can, if they want to tee it up again and go after Kathy Neely, they can do that. But I think that the jury spoke, and the only reason Kathy Neely wasn't sitting at counsel table or at the defense table during this trial was because her case was severed because she had previously cooperated with the government. So they convinced the judge that she should have a separate trial. But I think that all the evidence was presented in this case, the same evidence that would be presented for Kathy Neely, and I think that the jury spoke. I think it would be silly for the government to go after Kathy Neely at this point in time.
Now, I'm just curious because I'm obviously not a lawyer, but at one point the judge had said that she would toss out any convictions on these mail fraud counts, citing a lack of evidence. Now, I'm trying to figure this out. Isn't that up to a jury to decide? What am I missing from that aspect of the case?
Yeah, but the judges have the right to come in and essentially vacate the judgment if there is not enough evidence that supports that particular finding, if there's an insufficiency of the evidence to support guilt beyond all reasonable doubt. And I think that was, I think that's what she was thinking, you know, initially when they were going through figuring out what counts would be in the charge. I think at that point in time, the judge had intimated that maybe there wasn't enough evidence for the jury to even consider some of these charges. And the government, they threatened at that point in time to file what's called an interlocutory appeal. An interlocutory appeal is an appeal that happens right then, and you don't wait till the case is over. So what would have happened is we essentially would have called a timeout in the middle of the trial to figure out what the appellate court says about whether or not those charges should even be given to the jury for consideration. So rather than doing that, the judge said, listen, we'll let the jury consider it, and then I'll figure out what I'm going to do after the fact. In hindsight, what she did was great because the jury did exactly what she said when she didn't think there was enough evidence. They said the same thing regarding the bribery and the corruption counts.
The judge in this case very quickly is telling the prosecution they have a month to decide whether or not they want to retry Price on these 4 counts of tax fraud. Do you think they'll try to retry those charges, and is there any reason to think that the decision would be different with another jury?
Well, what I think that they need to do is they need to take a step back. I'm sure that the government's a little bit embarrassed. This is a loss. This isn't a draw by any means whatsoever. The government lost this case. The hung jury was on the tax counts. That's what they thought was their slam dunk. So maybe, I don't know, maybe they do retry it. Do I think that it will be different? I think that what's going to happen is the government would use a lot of money, a lot of expense in order to do the same thing, and you might get the very same result every time this case is tried.
Thank you very much for joining us. I very much appreciate it. Christopher Lewis talking about the not guilty verdict of Dallas County Commissioner John Wiley Price. My name is Dan Madison for Grant on News and Information 570 KLIF.